let's talk about control of scatter radiation. The two big branches of control that we're going to talk about, ways to control scatter radiation, deal with collimation and grids. Okay? And the important thing here, one way to think about this, is here I got my patient, right? Collimation, and let's say this is my image receptor. And this is, oh my goodness. This is my x-ray. This is the state of Delaware. This is an x-ray tube. Collimation is going to affect things, the control of scatter on the image production side of the patient, right? And grids are going to control it in the remnant beam. Okay, they're going to be between the patient and the image receptor. So collimation between the tube and the patient. Grids are going to be between the patient and the image receptor. So do two different things. So, image forming x-rays are those things that either interact within the patient and are fully attenuated, or exit the patient and interact with the image receptor. We're going to call that spectrum the spectrum of image forming x-rays. But there's four basic x-ray paths. There can be the x-rays that interact with the patient and scatter away from the receptor. So they're not attenuated, they just Compton scatter. Remember, Compton scatter can happen in what direction? All directions. All directions. So scatter away from the back, scatter off the patient, whatever. Scatter and hit you. And it's not an image forming x-ray. It just contributed to your dose. Image x-rays interact and they're absorbed. So photoelectric absorption. We like photoelectric effect. We like photoelectric absorption because it's going to involve an entire attenuation. It is going to produce an ion, but it is not going to result in additional scatter, except for at rare kind of discrete energies. Okay, we'll talk about more about that. Another option, x-rays are transmitted through the patient without interaction and strike the receptor. So you'll see these are kind of listed in this graphic here from our book, the different kinds of things. We've got A, bouncing off and going in a different direction, B, photoelectric, C, going directly through the patient and hitting the image receptor. Then, kind of finally, Compton scatter, which scatters towards the image receptor. So we have this interaction, and it goes off at an angle, right? If this angle is significant enough, it's going to be noise, right? It's going to tell us that there's information in that area of the patient's anatomy when there's really not that information there. We're going to call that scatter, and we're going to say it does a number of things. Number one, it decreases image contrast. That's the number one problem with scatter. Number two, contributes to occupational exposure. If I'm standing out in the room with the patient, I x-ray them, some of that scatter is going to come off the patient and hit me. And bear in mind, there's like millions upon millions of x-ray interactions going on to form a single x-ray image, right? So we're talking about millions and millions of scatter events. So this is an interesting chart in that it shows us how as KVP increases, photoelectric effect falls off and Compton interactions increase. Okay? So why is that important?
Because Compton is the stuff that makes poor images. Photoelectric is helpful.
Right. So the book has a graphic in it that talks about, like, this is like the incidence of photoelectric effect versus Compton at increasing energy, right? So here's KVP, right? So as KVP increases, what it's saying we're going to see is photoelectric effect is going to start to fall off, and the percentage of Compton effect is going to start to go up. So KVP is directly tied to scatter, right? This is the reason why, as we use KVP typically with a fixed amount, and we vary the film quality based largely on mass, right? Because KVP is going to have a direct tie to certain kinds of anatomy. Knowing what we know about how KVP impacts scatter, right? If I'm shooting a chest x-ray, what kind of subject contrast does the chest have? High subject contrast. So I'm going to want to reduce that high subject contrast. I want to see more shades of gray on my image, right? So what kind of KVP should I choose? A higher KVP. We shoot chests at a high KVP. It has a high subject contrast. I'm trying to reduce that subject contrast, and so I'm increasing my KVP. Right? What am I doing? I'm increasing scatter. I'm increasing scatter. Right? But that's going to also create a subsequent increase or decrease in contrast. Okay? So what I just posed to you, honestly, is one of the most difficult questions that I ask students. Keep it in the back of your mind. It gets flipped upside down in every which way. We're going to spend an entire lesson talking about just that question. All right? But for the initial understanding, I want us to get the idea that's illustrated both here on this graphic and on this, that this photoelectric effect, I can't spell, electric, is going to fall off, right? And Compton is going to increase as I increase my KVP. Okay? That's the first step to understanding something that is quite elegant and beautiful. But every time that I explain it, I have to almost explain it to myself because it is a fairly complicated thing. Don't be intimidated by it. But grasping this simple, and this is just physics, y'all. Like, this is just the physics of how these interactions occur. Statistical averages of these interactions occurring. But we're going to use what we know about this physics to manipulate the quality of our pictures. Okay. So the very first thing that we talk about when we talk about scatter is collimation. Collimation, as I increase my collimation, and you could even have that table out from your outline, because I think collimation's on there. As I increase my collimation, I'm going to do what to my scatter?
Increase.
So what is that going to do to my image contrast?
Increase it.
I'm going to increase my image contrast. Yep. And I'm also going to improve, I'm going to reduce patient dose and improve contrast resolution. Okay? So reduce scatter, reduce dose, improve contrast resolution. Say that to yourself all day long because you're going to see techs all day long who do not collimate. It's a no-brainer. It's an absolutely a no-brainer. It is like X-rays 101. But I've heard all sorts of arguments for why you don't need to collimate. You'll clip anatomy. Well, then you need to know your anatomy better. You're reducing your image contrast. You're increasing your patient dose. And you're possibly increasing the amount of your own personal dose by increasing scatter. Okay. So here is a schematic of a variable aperture collimator. Have y'all seen the one that we have in the closet over there? Have y'all had a chance to look at it? Yeah. We can get it out again. You can see how it operates. It's got some mirrors as well as shutters that you can change the size of the collimated area, right? In addition to these variable aperture ones, we used to use these more, and the book talks about kind of different kinds of like cones and cylinders and things like that, right? So there's there would be what we call like a diaphragm type one. This is just one that you insert directly into the machine, and it's just going to collimate just to that block shape. Then you can put a cone on there, And we used to use these for sinus CT studies. They would enhance contrast on a sinus CT. But most of what people are using now are these variable aperture type collimators, and typically they have what's called PBL, positive beam limitation, right? That means that when I set up for an x-ray of a hand, right, and I tell it I'm doing an x-ray of the hand, it's going to collimate immediately to the size of the receptor area, right? If I want to make it bigger or smaller, I think I can make it smaller, but I can't make it bigger, right? If I want to make it bigger, I'm going to need to override that in some way. Do y'all see those kinds of decisions being made? Some? Okay, good. I'm curious, how are those kinds of decisions made? Like, what kind of machines are you working on? Siemens? GE? What do you have to do? Do you override it in the software? Do you override it right there at the collimator? How do you override it?
Generally, I've had a couple that you could pull it if you wanted to, and it would actually just go right back, or it actually lock in place. Now, most of the places we go, we run into the problem of, like you said, people just don't collimate.
Yeah.
If it's got one of those PBLs on it, usually they just shoot it.
They're good to go. Okay. All right. Good, thanks. That's helpful. Yeah, I can't even begin to stress how much this stuff changes just on a day-by-day, almost year-by-year basis. So grids, you see now, grids are on the opposite side of the patient in this area that we call the remnant beam, right? So this is the area where x-rays are exiting the patient and going on to interact with the image receptor, okay? So we're going to place a grid in that area and use them to absorb scatter x-rays. So they actually increase patient dose. It's kind of the big thing about grids. If I'm using a grid, I'm going to need to increase my mass and subsequently increase my patient dose, okay? So collimation decreases patient dose, grids increase patient dose. They both increase what?
Image contrast?
Contrast. So again, if we were to go back and look at that ART table, you can kind of see where you can start to plug in the arrows and all this stuff we start to see how some of these technical factors interrelate. 3 types of grids: focus, parallel, and crosshatch. The first one that Mr. Bucky made was a crosshatch one. Most of what we use now are either parallel or focused. That is significant. So let's spend some time talking about off-focus radiation and stuff like that. And we will come back to filtration. Let me just mention real quickly. One other thing that we can do that can help with controlling scatter is filtrating the beam before it exits the tube. Okay? And we talked a little bit about how filtration is going to increase collimation and it will reduce patient dose. Okay? But there's kind of constraints and limits, and most filtration is just an inherent filtration, and we don't ever mess with it. We don't really mess with filters. Okay? But just be aware of that. So going back to grids, I'm sorry. The higher the ratio of the grid, the more we're going to increase the patient dose. So just the use of that grid, as you can see, for this grid to form an image, only certain x-rays can get through that grid. And so I'm going to need to increase the quantity of x-rays produced. And what technical factor is linked to the quantity of x-rays produced? Mass. Yep, my milliamperes per second. Right? My mass. But again, the principal function of the grid is to improve contrast. It is going to increase my patient dose. Okay? So if I'm going back to a patient care way of thinking about things, right? Because that's where the folks who are writing the boards primarily are coming from. Anticipate to have at least one patient care-ish kind of question about grids. What is the benefit of grids to the patient? What is the benefit of a grid to the patient? better picture, right? Higher diagnostic quality. But it does not reduce their dose. Okay. Let me see. This is, just a sec. This is the grid ratio, okay? And you will be asked to calculate this at some point in probably the board. So let's talk about how we calculate grid ratio. And there's always going to be a distractor here. They love these questions because there's a built-in distractor. So ratio, I think, equals what? H over D, I believe. Let me double check myself. I always know if I've got it wrong when I start working the math, but H over D, yeah. So H in this case, oh, it's right there, how nice. H is the height of the grid, right? So I'm looking at this grid more or less in axial view. I've taken a slice of the grid and I'm holding it up and I'm looking at it. I can see all these little lines, right? And there's going to be a measurement of the thickness of that grid. This is where the distractor comes in. When you're telling me that's the height, that sounds like the thickness to me. If I'm holding this thing up, if I held up that laptop, I would say, how thick is this thing, right? I wouldn't say how high is your laptop, right? So in my opinion, these variables are poorly described. It's asking me to think about this thing as a slice, and that descriptor height is if I had the grid laying on this table, like how high is this off the table, right? It's a distractor. The other distractor is this T, thickness. This is the thickness of the grid material itself, right? The thickness of the grid material itself. And so as you've gone through your textbook, be aware that a lot of these illustrations are really misleading. The thickness of grid material is incredibly thin, like a hair breadth, right? Really, really, really small stuff. But it has a certain height. And then there's a prescribed distance between those things. So if you can think through this, let me do it like this. Bear with me. Get rid of this stuff. If I'm a little x-ray running through the patient, right? And in this grid, I have a scatter event over here. So initially I was supposed to go down right here, right? But because of this scatter event, I go off in this direction. Bam, I hit the grid, right? So this grid is going to stop that off-focus x-ray. All right. And the way that we know how it's going to stop that is by plugging this into the formula. So they're always really, really, really small numbers. Let me see. Have y'all had opportunities to work this formula out? This is all like Greek to you? Okay. Let's look at a formula for it, just so we've had an opportunity to calculate one of them. All right. So I'm looking at page 197 in our textbook. No, I take that back. 196. It has, in general, top of the second line. In general, grid ratios from 1.5 to 16 to 1, higher ratio grids are used most often with higher KVP radiography. An 8:1 to 10:1 grid is frequently used with general purpose X-ray imaging systems, whereas a 5:1 grid reduces approximately 85% of the scatter radiation. A 16:1 grid may reduce as much as 97%, right? We're going to use these higher grid ratios in a more controlled environment, so like in the department. We're going to use these lower grid ratios when we're out doing portables. Probably your average portable grid is like a 5 to 1 or a 6 to 1. So a grid is fabricated with, look at this, 30. What does that UM mean? What does that mean? See that problem? The grid is fabricated with what? Micrometers, 30 micrometers. So we're talking about something really, 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 really thin, right? And that is grid strip sandwiched between an interspace material that is 300 micrometers thick, right? The height of the grid ratio the height of the grid is 2.4 millimeters. What is the grid ratio, right? So again, remember, the distractor here, and he's even got it in this, is the thickness thing. You see what I'm saying? The thickness is actually indicating the distance. And this is how they'll pose it in the board. This is how they're going to jack with your mind. They're going to use thickness to describe the distance. So the way to set this up again is my ratio is going to equal, it was the 30 micrometers was actually the thickness of the grid material. Very, very thin. It should always be very, very thin. What was described as a thickness is actually the distance in this case, and it is 300 micrometers. So distance goes down on the bottom, 300 micrometers. And up on top, we need to convert millimeters to micrometer, so 2.4 millimeters. I'm on my little number line, right? Y'all are familiar with this guy. And I've got micro is like 0.001, right? And I'm sorry, milli is, micro is way far down here. 0.00001, right? Am I wrong about that? Okay, so I had this little breakout box here, 2.4 millimeters. I'm going to hop my little thing over. 1, 2, 3, 4, right? 1, 2, 3, I'm sorry. You understand what I'm doing? Okay. 2,400 micrometers. So if I do that out, what is that? 8? 8 by 1. Questions about that calculation? Okay. You will never ever sit down in the department and say, I need to calculate what this grid ratio is so that I can take this x-ray. But they do expect you to know this information. All right, here is what Julie lastly alluded to, the significance of grids, is the way that grid positioning can influence our image. So, if I have my grid off level, what have I just done to the remnant beam? Yeah, you're going to have like a zebra striped x-ray, right? Oh, I've done this one. Which one was it? It wasn't off level, upside down grid. That was a really pretty picture. So, what can y'all imagine what this picture looked like? The upside down grid.
Too magnified.
It was actually just kind of like really fuzzy. Like it had a lot of quantum noise because I'd flipped it around. It allowed some of the X-rays through, but it looked like I'd taken the X-ray and scrubbed it on the sand or something. So understanding how these grids work and whether they're focused or not or parallel is going to impact the kinds of ways that I can use the grid. Primarily, regardless of whether it's focused or parallel or anything like that, the two big rules are make sure that the grid is not sitting there funny, at some funny angle. So this is why you see I don't know if you're ever doing portable chest x-rays, you need to use a grid. The technologist is doing some kind of thing to make sure that the collimator is more or less lined up with the direction of so the X-ray beam is more or less perpendicular to the image receptor. This part of their concern has to do with I'm using a grid, I don't want it to be off level. Right? Another thing that's important you'll see is off center. Right? How does that impact the grid? Let's talk about it just a sec. So if it's a parallel grid, we're not as concerned about this, but if it's a focus grid, this can have an impact, right? There's going to be a center to the grid, right? And to establish that center, they've actually done some calculations, right, to determine normal distances at which x-rays might be taken, like the shortest distances, like let's say 40 inches, right? And knowing what they know about this distance of 40 inches, right, they've been able to calculate what the divergence is, right? Why does that matter? Well, because there's divergence here on these edges of the x-ray beam. And so I would not want to construct this grid such that if it's not aligned, it's cutting things off, right? So they put little angles here. And the angles decrease as we get towards the center, and then they increase as we get further away from the center, right? That's why we call it a focus grid. Okay? That's all good and well until we get off center, right? Here I'm centered, but let's say I'm producing x-rays from over here. And I've collimated correctly. Let's say I've collimated this thing right, or whatever. But I have this divergence, bam! I just hit the grid, right? Because I was off center on it. Okay? So I'm going to have grid cutoff in this instance simply because I was not centered to the grid. So center it, center yourself to the grid, make sure it's not out of balance. Questions about that? Okay. All right, and here is how dose kind of increases depending on different grid factors. One of the reasons I showed you that St. Catherine's thing is because it has very nicely and neatly roughly what the grid factor is for different grid ratios. It's worthwhile going ahead and memorizing them, but you can also just do this, I believe. 5 by 1 is going to have a grid factor, I believe, of 1, right? 6 by 1 would have a grid factor of 2. So 7 by 1 would have a grid factor of 3. 8 by 1 would have a grid factor of 4, right? So I can just count. No, since I screwed up. Oh shoot, I did. I'm sorry. I'm an idiot. No grid has a. This has a 2. Okay, I apologize. No grid is a 1, right? I apologize for that. No grid is a 1. 5 by 1's a 2, and on down, right? Just count them down. The St. Catherine's gives you a table that you can apply as well. That'd be another thing worth checking out. And that's going to be, so if I decrease my grid ratio, say I go from shooting, initially I took this image at a 12 by 1, but I had too much cutoff. There were some other technical factors that need to be adjusted, and now I'm shooting at an 8 by 1 grid, right? Initially I was at a 12 by 1 grid. It's not a good picture. I want to go back and get a better picture, so I'm going to shoot it at an 8 by 1. What has happened with my grid factor? Did it increase or decrease?
Decrease.
It decreased. So what would happen to my mass?
Would also decrease.
It would also need to decrease by a considerable factor, right? If already just going from no grid to 5 doubled my mass, right? You can imagine how much grid factor is tied to patient exposure. It significantly increases patient exposure. And so I guess that's the last of that. Any questions on that?